Welcome to The Making of, the podcast from Swansea University that takes you behind the scenes of some remarkable success stories. In each episode, we sit down with extraordinary people to discover how they reached the very top of their fields, the highs, the lows, the lessons they learned along the way. I'm Andy Bush. I was honoured to study at Swansea University in the 90s, and in this episode, we are joined by Paul Millicheap, aka the poet Brian Bilston, who studied history at Swansea University. Brian has been called the Poet Laureate of Twitter, a title that reflects both his wit and his uncanny ability to distill modern life into verse that is sharp, funny, and quietly profound. We cannot wait to find out what role his time at Swansea University has played in creating the man he is today. Brian, welcome.
Thank you for having me on, Andy.
Well, it's great to have you here. Let's say straight away, something that makes this episode so exciting is that you don't show your face. So if you're watching this episode, Brian's appearance has been disguised. So I feel like I'm doing maybe a documentary with someone who's on the FBI witness relocation program. So it's an exciting, deeper level to this particular chat, Brian, but it's great to have you on. So of all the careers that we've had on this podcast series, being a poet, a lot of people must look at and think, how on earth do I do a university course that sets me on my way to being a professional poet?
Yeah, well, good question. And I still don't quite know the answer to that. In fact, thinking back to when I was 18 and starting in Swansea, I mean, the idea of that I'd end up somehow being a poet, having to state occupation as poet whilst going through, US customs, would have kind of, filled me with just utter bemusement. If anything, I think back then I'd probably despise any poets I would come across.
And so when you talk to people about what you do, obviously now I guess it's not something that you're reticent about, but at first you're kind of hinting at it there a little bit. You're almost a bit reluctant to say that because the people might have preconceptions of what a poet is or what a poet does.
That's right, and I think I used to think really being a poet was something rather pompous. I think particularly if you kind of declared yourself, if you sort of outed yourself as a poet. So for years, I would kind of shy away from that term, and I was just somebody who kind of wrote poems. I mean, that seemed to be an acceptable thing to do, but there's something rather kind of grandiose about calling yourself a poet. And I feel like there's only probably half a dozen people in the world who kind of by rights can really kind of call themselves that. So I'd be someone who wrote poems, or I'd be a writer, I'd be a scribbler, but hardly ever a poet.
And then we know when you look back at things over your lifetime that you wanted to be when you were a kid, did you go through a few different things? Brian, did you want to be, work for the fire service or go into space, and then you kind of settled on towards the literature side of things or not? What were the things you wanted to be?
Yeah, the whole astronaut thing didn't work out for me, and so I thought I'd turn to poetry to come to terms with the whole thing. Well, I think like a lot of boys kind of growing up originally, I wanted to probably be a professional footballer. Again, that didn't work out for me. I think I realised at quite an early age, probably about the age of 6, that I never was really going to be. And then when I was a teenager, I wanted to be a pop star. I wanted to be in bands, and for a few years as a teenager in 20s. Indeed, when I was at Swansea, I was in various kind of bands, but always kind of in the background. And don't think my heart was ever completely in it. I wasn't ever prepared to sort of take a big gamble and think, right, that was going to be the career for me. I'm going to go all out for it. So I kind of for a lot of time I just sort of stuck with the things that I enjoyed. So whether that was listening or making music, or it was reading books, a bit of writing here and there, and but with no real preconceptions about really where I wanted to go in life.
I mean, I grew up with what I consider to be fairly stern poetry, the likes of Keats, etc., reading that at school. What early poetry do you remember reading and enjoying, and which poetry do you remember reading and not enjoying so much?
Yeah, I think I liked poetry when I was at primary school, because poetry seemed sort of fun and funny, and I remember reading Spike Milligan and absolutely loving that when I was a kid. In fact, my mum and dad found this bag of old school stuff that they gave to me last year that was knocking around in their house in their attic for years, and I read a poem that I'd written. I thought, that was amazing. A poem that I've written when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I thought that's brilliant, absolutely fantastic, and I nearly shared it on social media. It was a good job I didn't because I, uh, I took another look at it and I thought, "Well, actually, that poem's too good." And I sort of Googled it and found out I just copied out Spike Milligan poem. Um, yeah, I like that stuff, and then when I got to my teenage years, we had to do more difficult poetry written a number of centuries ago, and I found that hard. But I think I did English A level and got into reading Philip Larkin. He was on the curriculum, and there was something about Larkin and his combination of kind of bleakness and humor and swearing that appealed to like a teenager growing up in Thatcherite Birmingham.
And then in terms of that early poetry that you wrote, Brian, were these kept in little notebooks, or what kind of where did you write your poetry, and how did you write your poetry back then in the early days?
Well, I probably wasn't even writing poetry when I was a teenager. It wasn't really until my late 20s that I started to write anything. And yeah, it would be in notebooks, and it wouldn't. I'd rarely kind of share anything that I'd written with anyone else. When I started kind of working, I'd often be the guy who was kind of roped in to write something for someone's like leaving do or like a birthday celebration. So that was probably my most kind of public outing of my poetry. But generally, it was sort of I'd keep it to myself, partly because I didn't think anyone would be interested in what I was writing, partly because I thought it wasn't any good, I guess, and I was probably quite right with me about most of that, to be honest.
And who's the first person that you kind of showed it to? Did you have someone that you can confide in that would give you their honest opinion and you trusted them?
Well, no, I didn't really share. I mean, like I said, I didn't really kind of share it with anyone. Even now, I hesitate to share my poems with anyone ahead of it. In fact, I even hate just having to send off a manuscript to my publisher. I'd rather not. I'd rather than just take my word for it that it's all brilliant and ignore any constructive or indeed negative feedback they might give me. So I do work quite independently. Um, even now, and I've kind of shared a few things with my wife, but and she really is my biggest critic, and that's why I probably don't share very much with her.
And then there's such a big chasm. It's quite a scary chasm between, the kind of on the rails element of GCSEs or O levels and A levels, college, and then going to university. How did Swansea University come into your life and into your thinking then, back then?
As I said earlier, originally I kind of wanted to be in a band and be famous. I grew up in Birmingham, and I was in a band in Birmingham, so I wanted to kind of stay in that area to stay with the band, but it didn't really work out for me. And so I started looking further down my list, and I went to an open day at Swansea, and I just love the place. I love the feel of it. I, maybe it's because Birmingham is so far away from the sea, but there was something quite special about going to Swansea and imagining myself being there. And although I ended up studying history, I originally was going there to study English lit, and yeah, I was just kind of very impressed with the whole place. I think at that stage I was vaguely aware that Kingsley Amis had been a lecturer there in the English department for a while too, and I just got into on the back of Larkin. I'd started reading sort of comic fiction too. I started reading some kind of Kingsley Amis there too, and probably things like that had some sort of subconscious effect on me too.
And then, the extracurricular stuff you mentioned, the music and everything as well, such an important part of university and your university experience. What kind of venues back then still, have a special place in your heart from Swansea?
Yeah, well, I used to go to a lot of a lot of clubs back in those days. Probably about five out of the 7 days of the week, I would be in some sort of nightclub. But the favourite was on a Tuesday night in Cinderella's at the end of the
Oh, yeah.
pier. And Tuesday night was sort of, I think it was billed as like alternative night. And the guy there was great because he had this brilliant taste in music, but also he was really receptive. So you could bring your own records along sometimes, and he'd put them on, and it really opened my ears to all sorts of music I'd not really come across before. So I got into bands like Pixies and Stone Roses, early Teenage Fan Club when I was kind of there, and they've kind of stuck with me kind of ever since.
And did many bands come through and play? Did you go and watch a lot of gigs when you were at university?
When I was in Swansea, I think I saw the Fall a couple of times. Saw the House of Love. I saw Carter, the Unstoppable Sex
Wow,
Machine. I saw uh, I saw a very early appearance from Blur and Primal Scream. They were playing in the kind of student Mandela Bar at the time. In fact, a I think I had a one of my finals was taking place the next day, and I thought I'll go and see Blur, see if they're any good. So I went on to see them. But also I kind of travel. I traveled to Cardiff and to Bristol. I'd be part of the gig going club. We'd all jump on a bus together. And one of my favourite gigs ever was seeing a brilliant sort of poetry pop band called the Blue Aeroplanes in Bristol in 1989.
great bands. That's
Yeah,
fantastic. I mean, I remember watching the Long Pigs play at Barron's. Was Barron's part of
yeah.
your resume of different clubs you used to go to back in the day? But it had like a glitter striped, a curtain that you'd have at like a working men's club. They played in front of that, and it was just absolutely fantastic to see such a great band in such a small venue. That was one of the great things about Swansea.
Yeah, no, Barron's was definitely there. I think it was Thursday night in Barron's, and I feel like I was there when Barron's first opened. I mean, it might have been called something else before that. But I did think, oh yeah, I now need to go out on a Thursday night too. So yeah, I mean, somewhere I must have done some studying, I guess.
But I mean, well, one thing on the going out and enjoying all that Swansea has to offer side of things is something that's kind of prevalent now. But I'm imagining it wasn't the case when you were university. But I mean, tell me if I'm wrong on this. And that's like open mic nights. There's so many poetry open mic nights around that you can go to, like in say in London or whatever. Was that a thing when you were at university, Brian?
Um, it might well have been a thing, but it wasn't anything I really encountered back then. I feel like that's kind of grown a lot over the last 20 years, but probably back in the early 90s, there weren't so many chances for that sort of thing to happen. Um, which is a bit of a shame, really. I mean, it could have been I just didn't move in those circles, but I'm kind of thinking back actually to thinking about all those gigs that I did go to and sort of stand and watching other people, and I think maybe as much as any, reading any poet, one of the things that's most inspired me has been going to see people perform in some way live, and I find it al- almost always inspiring, even if I don't necessarily like what it is I'm seeing. The fact of like human beings getting up on stage and sharing with people, their kind of outputs of what they've been figuring out, what they've been doing in their bedrooms or whatever, is always been a big motivating factor for me. Thinking, there's something in me, I can do something myself.
And then, do you remember your first day at the university?
I I do, I found it tough. I found the first day tough. Found the first week tough. I'm naturally quite shy, and I didn't know anyone else who was going to Swansea, and I was in halls, and it felt like other people instantly became kind of friends all around me, and I kind of shuffled down to get my food, get my dinner in the evening, and I felt kind of quite out of place. And it wasn't really until about my fifth or sixth day that actually somebody asked me to play kind of mini golf with them on the seafront there, and I actually thought, oh, that's like a social thing I'm doing, and I might have actually made a friend. And then as soon as I had made one friend, then I made another, and then it's just sort of built from there. But when you're quite shy, it's really hard. Um, it's really hard just settling in, and I've really, you know, I've had my own kids go off to university and seen them have to kind of go through this process too. And no matter how many social media groups get set up beforehand, it's still always a tough time. I think those first 24 hours, first few weeks, or whatever.
Do you know what, it's really interesting you should say that, because that completely mirrors my experience at the university. I was in Newarth Sibley when I first started at Swansea, and I just couldn't really get on with it at the beginning. I felt like, exactly how you say, everybody else was making friends apart from me, and I felt like a real outcast. And then I ended up shifting over to the student village, Hendra Foylan Student Village, and was in a more kind of like, you know, run of the mill house complex with 4 or 5 other people, and it kind of went from there, really, to be honest with you. So sometimes you just got to, so someone's listening to this, Brian, saying they might be feeling like they're not blending in and they haven't made fast friends like they do at home. It's just a matter of time before you find your people, right? And then, did you get involved on campus a lot, Brian? Were you in any clubs or societies, radio, magazine, SUTV, anything like that?
Well, I've never been one of life's natural joiners, it must be said. Um, I think I went, I think uh, yeah, in a fit of sociability, I went and joined the Ramblers Association and went on a nice walk there my first week. Actually, that helped. I did meet some friends, make some friends there too. Um, but really, apart from I joined a sort of gig society to go to gigs around the area, and also I play football. Play football for my halls. Made some friends through that, and played for the Swansea second team a couple of times. But it was too much like hard work, to be honest. It was they'd make you do things like run around the pitch multiple times, and
Outrageous.
yeah, I wasn't really into that.
But it sounds like you were, even though you say you were not one of life's great joiners, though you will. It sounds like your university experience. You did put yourself out there a little bit. You went and played crazy golf that led you to meet other people, and it's a bit of a curveball trying the rambling side of things. I mean, maybe this is an interesting Freshers Week angle, but you've just got to throw yourself into a few things and maybe just step outside your comfort zone a little bit. Do you think?
Yeah, you do, and it really isn't easy stepping outside your comfort zone. In fact, I've become better at doing that the older I've become, and now it makes me think that I should have done that a lot more when I was younger too. Yeah, with the benefit of kind of hindsight. And there were other things too. Like I was in a band when I was in Swansea. But that wasn't until my second year. A band had kind of formed in the first year, and then their bass player dropped out, and I'd um, I just happened to have the room next door to their existing bass player, and I played the bass, and so I kind of filled in there, and that was a big, you know, that was a big opening for me too, because then I made a whole bunch of like music mates, and we go and do gigs around Swansea and a few other places too, and that was a lot of fun.
What was the name of your band?
Yeah, we were known as Mad Cow, and we were. One write-up described us as Swansea's answer to the Happy Mondays. Read into that what you will.
What an
I think,
accolade! Uh,
yeah, I think it was partly based on the fact that we did have a dancer in our band,
wow.
and although he wasn't officially a part of the band, he was just somebody who would come along to our gigs, and then just before we went on stage, he'd disappear off to the loo and then get changed. Uh, he was about 6'6" and also from Birmingham, and he'd get changed into a leotard and a flowery bathing cap, and all of a sudden he would just appear on stage and just with his maracas and just start dancing around us. So
Gee, he sounds like Barry Mooncult, who was the dancer from the band Flowered Up. If you ever have heard of Flowered Up,
oh yeah, I do remember Flowered Up. That's right. Yeah, yes, I think probably more.
leotards, floral headwear. It's a kind of look.
It is. Yeah, it's the go-to look for any wannabe band dancer.
Well, I wonder what he does now. Do you ever think about your dancer guy and wonder what he does now for a career?
Well, I did actually bump into him about 5 or 6 years later, and he was a sports journalist for the Birmingham Evening
Wow,
Post. Yeah, so there we go.
amazing.
Not all career routes are linear.
Exactly, that's a great message in this episode. So, just to go back to your course a bit, then, Brian, how did being a history student help inform or develop your poetry? What role did history play?
Uh, that's a good question. In terms of my poetry itself, not didn't think it had a kind of direct impact, but I think there was something about studying history and being part of the humanities that helped further my interest just partly in just in the world itself, but also the world of words. You know, you have to do a lot of reading when you're a humanities student, and I surrounded myself with books. And actually, putting aside all the nightclubs and the gigs and all of that business, I was increasingly studious as my time went on, and spent a lot of time in that library. And the world that I ended up inhabiting after Swansea, I surrounded myself with books and words and a love of learning. And I'm sure somehow that does filter its way into my poetry too. Like a few years ago, I wrote a book which was called Days Like These, which has a poem for every day of the year, and each poem links in with something significant about that day, often something that's happened in history. And I do feel quite inspired sometimes by reading, historical kind of anecdotes or stories, and thinking about those as kind of sparks for ideas for poems.
And then, Swansea's got some iconic buildings itself on campus, like Fulton House or the library. Were there spaces on campus that had a bit of an impression on you in terms of, the work that you did later on in your career, or has it stayed with you? Anything kind of in a physical sense about Swansea's campus?
Yes, well, I think Swansea left its mark. I mean, in quite a few different ways. I mean, in my final year, I lived in Uplands, and lived very close to where Dylan Thomas was born and spent his early years, and indeed used to play football a lot in Cumdonkin Park, which is this lovely, beautiful, small, secluded park there in Uplands. And I can still picture in my head, kind of even now. But like I think the general, the general kind of landscape of Swansea and the Mumbles and the Gower has really kind of stuck with me. I don't tend to write a lot about landscape or place necessarily in my poetry, but sometimes it does creep through. And I remember again thinking about that book, Days Like These. I decided to write a poem which celebrated the innovation of the that iconic red telephone box, and my thoughts immediately turned to that telephone box that I would go to at the end of my street in Swansea when I call home every week. Every Sunday, I call my mom to get the news from home and tell her that I was still alive. And it's you kind of those kind of things kind of stick with you. They really do.
I think about that a lot, actually. We used to queue at Hendra Student Village in a line to update parents and so on. I can't work out whether life at university is better or worse nowadays for being in contact with people all the time, because, you'd go away and your parents wouldn't hear from you really for an entire, weeks and weeks at a time. Whereas like now, I guess, parents have got communication in some form with their kids, or like my mum always sees what I'm up to on Instagram, and they're kind of sharing your life through what you're posting, but it was kind of different back then.
Yeah, and I think I think it's a lot harder for parents now than it used to be. Now that you can be in touch more frequently, in some ways, I feel like it must have been easier back in the day when you just didn't really expect any kind of contact, particularly if you were a son like me. The expectations were quite low, I would say. But now, you can basically track your child around, so if they've not come back to their house late at night.
And what are you like? You mentioned earlier on about your kids being at university. Are you a warrior dad, or checking phones all the time, making them check in, or are you kind of a bit more relaxed with things?
I'm relatively relaxed, and I mean they've all been through that now. But I was generally more relaxed than my wife about things, and I think that probably comes of being relatively irresponsible myself, and when I was that age, and then generally have kind of come through it okay. That I guess uh, I was very happy to let go of them for a while.
And was there a lecturer or a member of staff at the university that particularly inspired you?
Well, I loved Dr. Bruce Waller, um, who was my kind of tutor in my final year there. I did a specialized course on Bismarck and German unification, and I just really liked. Um, there was just something very welcoming. I mean, he was American, and I think he must have been at Swansea for quite some time. He's had this sort of easy kind of manner about him, hugely kind of intelligent and insightful, but also kind of funny. And I think for a while I did I did wonder about going into academia myself. I found him quite, he was an inspiring person, and I kind of thought, I looked at what he did and how he spent his time, and I thought that's potentially a career for me too.
And then, I mean, you're a great example of someone who succeeded in having a pretty unconventional job. What would your advice be to someone who wants to take a risk and do something a bit different to what the rest of the crowd are doing? Everyone's going one way, they want to go and slightly go the other. Would you encourage them to trust their instincts and stick with it?
I would, and um, I I would also say, don't worry if things don't work out, or they don't seem to necessarily take the path or the course that you were expecting. And I've ended up doing what I do through a very circuitous route. Um, but I think the thing I never uh, left sight of was what I enjoyed in life. And just thinking back to my time in Swansea and thinking back to my love of books, not just from studying, but also reading in my spare time. I really didn't know what I was going to do when I left Swansea, and it took me it took me a while until I kind of thought, well, I should do something with books, because I like being with books, and it doesn't really matter what it is right now, but if I can find a job in which I spend most of my time next to these objects that I like, then that's a starting point. So I ended up writing off to lots of bookshops and becoming a bookseller for a couple of years, which I absolutely loved. And there is a kind of, I didn't know it at the time, but there is that was the start of a trajectory for me, because I stayed around words, and from working in a bookshop, I ended up talking to the sales reps that would come in, who would selling us their books every week or every month. And somebody suggested I apply for a job um, in publishing. And when I was at Swansea, I didn't really know what publishing was. I had a friend who was interested in publishing, and I didn't know really what on earth it was that she was talking about. And uh, I really didn't. And it just seemed such a sort of broad, kind of woolly term. So I ended up going for this job, and ended up in publishing, which is where I spent, it's where I spent the vast majority of my kind of adult working life. I worked for an academic publisher for or publishers for about 25 years before moving into poetry full time. But again, I think it's by doing that, I found myself in a job where I was surrounded by books, I was surrounded by words, I was surrounded by authors, and also colleagues and friends who themselves were inspired by books and by words, and it kind of rubs off on you, and it means that it encourages you to be part of that world in different ways too.
And we talk a lot on this podcast series about following your dreams and sticking to your guns and your convictions, etc. But were you prepared to fail with it if it wasn't going to come off and you weren't able to be a poet full time? Would you have been fine with that? What was your kind of? Did you prepare yourself mentally for things not working out how you wanted to?
Well, yes and yes and no. I mean, I'm I'm quite unusual in some ways in that I've ended up writing poems and being, I guess, a poet, but it was never I never had that necessarily as an aim or a goal. A lot of what has happened to me um, has been by chance and uh, being probably in the right place at the right time without anything more strategic than that. So it's been rare I've had to kind of go through that process of preparing myself for disappointment because I simply I've had zero expectations in the first place about any of this. I suppose uh, the the time that was most at risk was when I did take the decision eventually, probably in the form of some sort of midlife crisis or nervous breakdown, that so I'd leave my relatively well-paid job in publishing a- and and have a go at writing full time. I think I think that was I think that was probably the time, but I suppose I was quite fortunate by that stage because I thought, well, if it doesn't work out, I can probably go back into I can probably go back into publishing. I could probably more or less try and pick up from where I left off there. So I had a kind of safety net.
Actually, it's really fascinating because I think one thing that comes through consistently with every successful person that we've spoken to in this podcast series, that circuitous route is a real commonality between everybody. And I think it's like, because you mentioned chance there, but I guess you kind of make your own luck if you stay at it and you stay with it and you keep trying to progress the best you can. You do kind of make your own luck in these situations, don't you think?
I suppose so. Yeah, I mean, you do, and I mean, I was I do feel I was lucky in terms of it was being the right place and the right time because I'd started to do a bit of writing in my spare time and I'd write for various occasions and scribbled away, and I but I never shared any of these poems, and it wasn't really until I joined social media that I'd have thought about sharing any of this stuff. And I think I joined social media probably at a time where um, it was a good time to be creative on social media. I joined Twitter, which is very sort of the wordiest of all the media platforms at a time before it wasn't a complete cesspool, and uh, it was it was also something that I could do kind of in my spare time. I could do it alongside my proper job, in theory. And so I could write a short poem on my way to work or in my lunch hour, or sort of do it around what I was doing. So I wasn't really having to take a kind of risk or a chance. But I guess maybe I mean I don't know. It's interesting, subconsciously whether I did wonder whether any of this was going anywhere. But I don't know. I'm not sure I did. I was just simply enjoying myself, and yeah, I'm not sure whether I made my own luck or it just sort of landed on my doorstep one day.
And you began, as we mentioned in the intro, as Paul Millici before adopting the pseudonym Brian Bilston. When did you make that change, and why did you make that change?
Oh well, I I'd used the pseudonym Brian Bilston when I was working in an office, and I would play football for the company I work for, and I'd write up do a match report afterwards, and which I would send round to my mates and sometimes more widely around the company, and also use it to write not just about the football but about internal company politics, all sorts of things. Anyway, I needed a kind of pseudonym to write these reports for, so I thought in a bit of a sort of Alan Partridge style way, Brian Bilston had the ring of a kind of local football correspondent. He used to write for he was billed as Brian Bilston of the Dudley Echo, and so I wrote these match reports, and then I kind of dusted it off when I joined Twitter for the first time because I go into meetings with people younger than myself, and they'd say things like how we need to optimize our social media strategy. We need to increase, our Twitter presence. I had no idea what they were talking about. So I thought, oh, well, under cover of darkness, I'll join Twitter under this old pseudonym of mine, Brian Bilston, and try and figure out what it is they're all talking about. And um, so I've been stuck with it ever since. Again, there's nothing strategic about it. There was no uh, end goal at all. And now, as a consequence, when I go around the country, people call me Brian.
Love that. And is there a freedom in having a pseudonym?
Yeah, I think there probably is, to be honest. I mean, certainly back in those old Twitter days, there was a lot of freedom because I didn't tell anyone that I was joining as Brian Bilston, and so I ended up uh, actually getting quite kind of Twitter famous with nobody, none of my colleagues at work, in fact, barely any of my friends or family knew I was kind of doing that stuff. And I think it did allow me uh, to write more freely. And like I say, I'm naturally um, quite shy and retiring, and I felt like the Brian on social media was a bit more. He was a bit more out there. He was a bit more. He's prepared to say the things that I was thinking, and to make those awful jokes that I wanted to make, but didn't really have the confidence. And the great thing about having a pseudonym is if people think it's crap, you can just blame it on them and pretend it's nothing to do with you.
I mean, you've been described as the Banksy of poetry. How do you feel about that?
Well, these are these are labels that publishers and so forth put on you to try and sell more books. The Banksy poetry is all right. I used to get called the poet laureate of Twitter, among I think alongside about 9 or 10 other poets. It must be said, and you know that was to be honest that was a bit like being you know a kind of writer in residence for a sewage farm or you know cultural ambassador for Weatherspoon. So I was less delighted about that label.
Culture ambassador for Weatherspoons sounds like an aspirational job that anyone should go for. That sounds fantastic. I mean, social media, as you rightly point out, has changed so much in tone recently, or over the past year or so. Do you look back at how do you view social media now? Is it something that you kind of like appreciate what it's done for you and it's helped you connect with readers, or you kind of done with it, or how do you feel about it as we stand right now?
Yeah, well, probably both those things, to be honest. So, I mean, I do. It did literally change my life. If I hadn't joined Twitter, none of this would have really happened for me because it was only by doing that that publishers became interested in what I was doing, and you know, a following was kind of built up, and so people became aware of what I was doing. Um, at the same time, I mean, I guess this is now 12 or 13 years later. I do feel quite sick of it, and not just Twitter. Most of the platforms, to be honest, and it's not the a lot of the people that are on it. I have lovely interactions most days with a lot of people, and they often inspire me to write new things, and they make me feel good about what I do. At the same time, I just can feel fatigued by it slightly. I think that partly stems from just having done it for so long, um, but also I don't. Yeah, I I don't know. I feel like everyone feels slightly fatigued by it too. It's
Yeah.
not quite what it used to be in some ways.
And you've used unconventional formats like Venn diagrams and spreadsheets, etc. Did your academic training help with those kind of things, the visual side of things, and the way it's quite a different presentation to the standard poet?
Yeah, almost certainly. And um, yeah, I would because when I worked in publishing, I worked with books across all sorts of different subject areas, from English lit and history and philosophy, through in the end to things like statistics and maths and chemistry and physics, uh, and I think all of that kind of would shine through in my poetry. And also, I think that working in office too, when I was writing all these poems, I ended up writing poems in like Excel spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations, all those kind of tools that I was using kind of every day. I think I kind of noticed quite early on in those social media days that I was operating in a very visual environment. My posts were going out surrounded by videos that people were posting up, or photos or cartoons, and so I did think quite consciously about um what should my poem look like, as well as what are the words? Is there something visual that I could do with this subject that might make people sit up and notice it?
And then, what would your advice be to someone who wanted to get into poetry, start writing poetry? What's the best first step to make?
Yeah, good question. I feel like I've come at this slightly sort of backwards, but I mean, I think the first thing is to read other poets. I think because it's only by reading other poets that you can that you help that you can really understand what it is that you like and what you might be able to do. And I mentioned Larkin back um, uh, when I was an A-level student, but actually, moving on from him, it was people like seeing John Hegley doing his poetry. It was reading Roger McGough's poetry that made me realize actually poetry is you're allowed to be funny. You can bring a sense of kind of humor, a sense of performance into what you're doing. And I think it's from reading them that allowed me to discover my own voice, which is never to imitate those people that I liked, but I think it was kind of I felt it was quite sort of freeing. It sort of opened my mind to the fact that poetry could be all sorts of different things. It didn't need to be this kind of stuffy um, poetry that I'd often end up having to study at school. So I think reading is really helpful in terms of discovering a voice. And I think the other thing I would say, and again, it's easy for me to say this, maybe, but it's write for yourself. Don't worry too much about writing for other people. If you're not doing it for yourself and from the heart, and to entertain yourself, and because you enjoy the act of what you're doing, then you think you need to question why you're doing it. I quite often get people say, "Oh, I'd love to build my social media following for my own poetry. How do I go about that?" And it's not for me. It's never really been about it. I've been messing around, having fun, enjoying myself, and then sharing some of what I've been writing with other people. And over time, and it did take a lot of time. Some of those poems took off, and then they snowballed. But I think if I'd set out trying to do that in the first place, I don't think I'd have been successful at all.
It's interesting because I think in terms of sharing it with the world, I think I'd be more likely to, even though I'd find it not embarrassing, but I'd be more reluctant to share a poem I'd written with someone than a piece of art that I'd drawn. Do you know what I mean? There's something about it. It's very, very personal, isn't it? And it also it almost slightly insinuates something or how you feel about yourself that here's a poem that I've written. It's a hard first step for people, isn't it?
It is a hard first step, and I mean, I think, as you said previously, it was helpful for me that I did have this pseudonym to hide behind, and people didn't know I was doing it. Also, I think that for me, the kind of poetry that I write, I don't necessarily always, wear my heart on my sleeve. I mean, sometimes I write about political issues, for instance, or social things and things I feel deeply about, but I don't necessarily bring the I too much into my poetry. So I feel like I don't necessarily expose myself in that same way. And I guess the other thing is that actually it used to be a lot easier for me to write and share poems back in the day because I didn't really have any followers. There was nobody. I wasn't really taking much of it. Didn't feel like I was taking a risk when there was only 12 people following me, and 10 of those were like Russian bots. And so, really kind of who cares? It's far harder and scarier now knowing that my poems are going to be read by quite a lot of people to actually share anything new. I do still, I worry more now about sharing a poem than I used to.
So, looking back on all that you've achieved and everything, would you have done anything differently in terms of your university experience? Would you have it any other way?
Yeah, good point. A good question. Part of me is tempted to say, oh, I wish I'd begun this earlier. I wish I'd had the confidence to have started writing and showing and sharing my poetry with people, when I was in my 20s, when I first started to kind of do this, to kind of get out there. But then the other part of me kind of thinks, well, it wasn't the right time for me, and I feel like if that's what I'd really wanted to do, I I may well have I may well have done it, but really at that time, I had other considerations in my life, and, so I'm not sure I'd necessarily do anything differently. I recently I've been on tour with, Henry Normal, who's a brilliant poet in his own right, and also very, genius of, comedy kind of script writing, and he told me the story about when he used to work in an insurance office and, in his early 20s, and he was managing an office, and he had the sort of balls to one day think, "No, I don't wanna do this with my life. I wanna go and, you know, I wanna go and sort of write stuff and entertain people and make them laugh and all of that." Um, and I kinda thought that, why didn't I have that same thought? Because I did somewhere at the back of my brain, but I never had the confidence to kinda do it. And, but you build confidence in lots of different ways, and it comes in all shapes and forms, and I simply think that without those other years, those years in the academic publishing wilderness, I wouldn't have ended up doing this now.
And then you look back at Swansea University, your time at the university. How do you feel about that? What kind of emotions come to the fore when you picture Swansea and think about Swansea?
Well, I would say it's just, well, people say your school days are the best days of your life, but actually, I mean, I do. My 3 years in Swansea were amongst the best years of my entire life, and I still friends with a lot of people there now. I go back quite regularly. I've still got friends who are there. In fact, I'm doing a gig there in November, and we're having a bit of a kind of uni kind of reunion
Oh,
when
wow.
I kinda go back there, and it's people I've not seen for quite a while. So it's got, yeah, I still have a lot of kind of fondness. So it's again, it's hard to, you kind of imagine what would my life be like if I went somewhere else. I can't really imagine what it would be like if I went somewhere else. Um, I wouldn't, I wouldn't exchange those 3 years for any 3 years anywhere else.
Amazing. Well, it's been brilliant to chat to you. Thank you so much for giving us an insight into what has made you the person you are today. Paul Miller-Cheap, aka Brian Bilston. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Andy. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.